It's a cold night. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making you feel like you're not just standing in the night, you're trapped in it. Have you ever walked alone through a dark, silent neighborhood and suddenly felt watched? You try to shake the feeling, but it doesn't go away. That was how Emma felt one evening when she stepped out of her apartment for a simple walk. The air was thick with tension, and the silence around her wasn't peaceful. It was unnerving. She couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. She wasn't alone. Not in the way she thought. It started innocently enough, like most strange things do. A glance over her shoulder. An unusual figure standing motionless at the far end of the street. At first, Emma thought it was just a trick of the light. A shadow cast by the dim street lamp. But as she continued her walk, she couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were following her, watching her every move. The figure didn't move, but the energy around it was enough to make her heart race. She could feel it deep down like an instinct. Something was off. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing in the empty street. But no matter how fast she walked, the sense of being followed only grew stronger. And then, just as she was about to turn a corner, she heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost inaudible, but distinct enough to make her freeze. A turn. Nothing. The street was still. The figure was gone. But that whisper. It lingered. You shouldn't have come. Emma didn't know what that meant or who had said it, but the words felt like a warning. A warning she couldn't ignore. Something was waiting for her. Something that had been following her for longer than she realized. Her breath caught as she heard footsteps behind her. Faint but unmistakable. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest. There was no one there. The street was empty. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. Emma tried to brush it off, telling herself she was just imagining things. Maybe it was the stress or the exhaustion from work. But every night the feeling would return. And each night the whispers would grow louder. You shouldn't have come. The figure would appear in the distance, its silhouette outlined against the darkness, always just far enough to keep her on edge. But then things took a darker turn. The whispers began to shift. No longer warnings, but commands. It wasn't just watching her anymore. It was trying to communicate. And whatever it wanted, Emma knew it wasn't good. Tonight, as she walked through that same street, the whispers were almost deafening. The figure, now closer than ever before, stood silently in the shadows. Its eyes, cold and hollow, locked onto hers. It's too late now, it whispered, as if it already knew what she feared. What did it want from her? And why was it so determined to make sure she couldn't escape? The answers would come, but Emma had no idea how much further she would need to go before she found out the truth. Would she survive this encounter, or would she become another lost soul wandering in the dark? The air grew heavier, the figure moved closer, and Emma was about to find out that the most dangerous things aren't always what you can see. Stay tuned for the next part of Emma's story. Things are about to get a lot darker. Emma couldn't move. The figure was closer now, its presence nearly suffocating. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the overwhelming dread that had begun to creep through her veins like poison. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat heavy and erratic. She wanted to run to get away from it, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. She tried to look away, but its eyes were locked on hers, cold and lifeless, yet somehow full of something she couldn't quite comprehend. It was like they were pulling her in, deeper into the darkness. Her breath was shallow, coming in quick, sharp gasps. The air felt colder now, the kind of cold that made her skin prickle and her fingers stiffen. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep warm, though it was impossible. The chill seemed to seep into her very bones, making her feel fragile, exposed. She could hear the soft shuffling of the figure's footsteps, slow and deliberate, each one echoing in the empty street like a countdown. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but her voice felt trapped, a knot in her throat that she couldn't loosen. What was this thing? Why was it following her? And how did it know her name? Her mind raced back to the events of the past few days. It all started innocently enough, with strange dreams that seemed to blur the line between reality and nightmare. She had never been one to remember her dreams, but these dreams felt different. In them, she would find herself walking down that same street, hearing those same whispers. The figure would always be there, lurking in the shadows, just out of sight, but she knew it was there. She could feel its eyes on her, even in her sleep. First, she thought it was just stress. After all, her job had been demanding lately, and she had been working long hours. But then the whispers started in the waking world, and the figure, it started to appear, not just in her dreams, but in the corners of her vision. She would catch a glimpse of it in a mirror or a dark alley, its silhouette just on the edge of her sight, always vanishing when she turned to look directly. But now, it was no longer a distant figure. It was standing right in front of her, closer than ever before. "Who are you?" Emma finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The figure didn't answer. It didn't even move. It just stood there, watching her with those unblinking eyes. She took a shaky step back, then another, her feet moving almost instinctively. She had to get away. She had to find a way out of this nightmare. But every direction she turned, the figure seemed to follow, never getting closer, but never moving farther away either. It was as if it was part of the street, part of the very air around her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of the trance for a moment. She fumbled for it, her hands trembling, and saw a message from her best friend, Sarah. "Hey, you alright? You've been acting weird lately. Call me when you can." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't told Sarah about the whispers about the figure. She hadn't wanted to seem crazy. But now, as the coldness of the street wrapped around her and the figure's gaze bore down on her, she realized just how much she needed someone to help her make sense of all this. But before she could even type a response, the screen went black. No warning. No reason. Just darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. The phone was dead. And then, as if on cue, the figure took a step forward. Emma's pulse quickened. She turned to run, but her legs felt like lead. She stumbled, tripping over her own feet, but caught herself before falling. She had to get away. She had to. The sound of footsteps behind her. Too fast. Too close. She turned, and for the briefest of moments, she thought she saw a shadow move in the distance. A familiar silhouette, someone she hadn't seen in years. But when she blinked, it was gone. The whispers grew louder. "You shouldn't have come," it said again, this time not from the figure, but from all around her. "It's already too late." Emma froze. Too late. Too late for what? The whispers swirled around Emma, thick and suffocating, as if the very air was alive with secrets. "Too late," they repeated, almost mocking her. She could feel the weight of them pressing in from all sides, suffocating her thoughts, clouding her mind. She wanted to scream, to shout at them to stop, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the whispers had wrapped themselves around her lungs, preventing her from breathing, from thinking. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen in place, every muscle tense, her body trembling with the need to escape, to run. But the street was no longer just a street. The ground beneath her feet felt uneven, as if the very pavement had shifted, its once familiar cracks and lines now twisted and unfamiliar. The shadows lengthened around her, curling and twisting like living things, and she could have sworn she saw figures lurking just beyond her vision. Figures that didn't belong. With a sudden, overwhelming sense of urgency, she turned and bolted down the street, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. She didn't know where she was going, just that she needed to get away from the figure, from the whispers. She ran faster, her breath ragged, her mind clouded with fear. The world seemed to close in on her, the buildings narrowing, the streets becoming a maze. It was like she was running through a nightmare, a place where nothing was real, but everything felt painfully, suffocatingly real. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see the figure right behind her, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty street, the shadows, and the thick fog that seemed to roll in from nowhere. She stopped for a moment, gasping for air, her body shaking with exhaustion. The chill in the air had intensified, biting into her skin, making it feel as though she was being frozen from the inside out. She looked around, trying to get her bearings, but the street was no longer familiar. And then, just as she thought she might be safe, she heard it. The soft shuffling of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Her blood ran cold. She spun around, but again there was nothing there. Just the street, stretching out endlessly in front of her. The figure wasn't close. Not yet. But it was there, she could feel it. Watching her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. "What do you want from me?" The answer came, but not in words. It came in the form of a shadow, a flicker just on the edge of her vision. A shape, human but not, moving in the fog. It was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by something she couldn't quite make out. Yet the chill in the air grew colder, more intense, and she could feel the presence closing in. It wasn't just the figure now. It was something more, something older. Suddenly, she felt the urge to turn and run again, but this time something stopped her. A memory, a flash from her past, surged to the forefront of her mind. It was a memory she had tried to forget, a memory that had always been buried beneath years of distraction and denial. When Emma was a child, she used to visit her grandmother's old house, a place as full of memories as it was of secrets. It was always too quiet there, too still, as if the house itself was waiting for something. Sometimes, she would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of whispers, faint voices calling her name. Her grandmother would always dismiss it, saying the house had a way of making you feel as though you were never alone. But Emma knew better. She had always known that there was something in that house, something that didn't belong. Her grandmother had often spoken of the guests in the house, those who had passed but never fully moved on. Emma never understood what she meant, but now, as the chill in the air grew heavier and the whispers louder, she wondered if her grandmother had known more than she ever let on. Had she been one of those guests? Was this figure, this presence, something connected to that old house? Something that had been following her all these years? Her mind raced as she stumbled back, her body aching from the strain. What was this thing? And why was it after her now? A sudden thought struck her. What if it wasn't just a haunting? What if she had something to do with it? Something in her past, something she had overlooked that had awakened this thing, this force. The memory of her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Some things are better left untouched. Her pulse quickened as the fog thickened around her, and she realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that she was no longer sure if she was running away from the figure, or running toward something much darker. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the fog swallowed her whole. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the very ground beneath her feet was pulling her into the depths of the unknown. Her breath came in shallow gasps, fogging the air in front of her, as if the world around her was closing in, suffocating her. Every shadow seemed to twist, every rustling sound seemed too close, too deliberate. She could feel it now, the presence not behind her but all around her, pressing in like a wall of cold, unseen hands. The whispers had stopped, but they hadn't gone. They lingered in her mind, a steady hum of dread, growing louder the longer she stayed in the fog. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her throat was too tight. The silence around her was deafening, and yet in it, she could hear the faintest rustling, like someone or something was moving just out of sight. She turned sharply, scanning the dimly lit street, but there was no one there. No figure. No shadow. Just the fog, thickening by the second like it was alive, breathing with her, making it harder to breathe. Her thoughts spiraled. What was this thing? What did it want? And why did she feel like she was being pulled toward it, as if something inside her was guiding her steps, urging her to keep going? For a brief moment, she considered stopping, standing still, hoping that if she just remained quiet, if she just let the shadows pass her by, it would all end. But she couldn't shake the feeling that standing still would only make things worse. It was as if the more she resisted, the more the darkness would consume her. There was no way out. Not anymore. And then in the distance she saw it. a faint glimmer of light cutting through the fog. It was small, barely visible, but it pulsed with an eerie rhythm like a heartbeat. A part of her wanted to turn away, to run in the opposite direction, but her legs wouldn't move. Instead, her body seemed to carry her forward, closer to the light, closer to whatever waited for her there. With every step, the air grew colder, the light brighter, more urgent, until it seemed to pulse directly in her chest, as if it were calling to her. Emma's skin prickled, her senses on high alert. She could almost hear the whispers again, now more insistent, more frantic, but she couldn't make out the words. They were just sounds, chaotic and disjointed, pushing against her thoughts. She could feel them as if they were inside her head, clawing at her sanity. When she reached the light, she froze. It wasn't just any light. It was coming from an old, ornate lantern hanging from a wrought iron post, the kind she remembered seeing outside her grandmother's house. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she stepped closer, the fog swirling around her legs like a living thing. The lantern's glow was faint, but it held a strange warmth, a promise that made her hesitate, her hand hovering near the glass. It seemed almost too real, too solid in this dreamlike place, yet she knew deep down it wasn't. As she reached out to touch it, something behind her snapped. A branch. Footstep. It was too loud, too sudden, breaking the fragile silence that had settled over her. She whirled around, her heart nearly leaping from her chest, and there, standing just beyond the lantern's reach, was the figure. The figure that had been following her, watching her. It was closer now, so much closer, but she couldn't make out its face. It was as if it were cloaked in darkness, a shadow within shadows, and yet, the very air around it seemed to shimmer with the same cold, haunting light as the lantern. Emma took a step back, her breath caught in her throat, but the figure didn't move. Just stood there waiting, watching. The whispers swelled again, louder now, so loud it felt like they were drowning her, smothering her thoughts. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The tension in the air was unbearable, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It was waiting, and so was she. In that moment, the fog seemed to pull back, just for a second, revealing the shape of the figure more clearly. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a woman, or at least it had the shape of one. The same pale skin, the same eerie glow. Emma could feel the blood drain from her face as recognition hit her like a slap. It wasn't the figure that had been haunting her. It was something worse. Something far more connected to her past. But just as she tried to call out, to ask it what it wanted, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the lantern flickering wildly, as if it too could sense the danger approaching. The whispers reached a crescendo, and the figure stepped forward. Before Emma could react, the world went dark. The darkness was thick, suffocating, like the world had been swallowed whole. Emma's body felt weightless, suspended in the void, and for a moment, she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made her skin crawl. She tried to move, but her limbs felt frozen, trapped in place. Panic surged through her chest, her breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. She needed to wake up to escape, but the air around her seemed to press in, heavy and unyielding. Then, a faint light flickered at the edge of her vision. It was a soft glow, distant but unmistakable. She focused on it, willing her body to respond, to push through the unnatural stillness. The light grew stronger, and with it, the sense of dread deepened. This light wasn't the warmth she had felt earlier. No, this light was cold, piercing, like the flash of a distant star cutting through the night sky. Emma strained to reach it, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and need. The light beckoned her, and against every instinct, she moved toward it. As she took a step, the world around her shifted. The darkness began to peel away, revealing a scene so familiar it made her stomach turn. She stood in the same fog-choked street, but everything was wrong. The buildings around her were warped, distorted, like a twisted reflection in a broken mirror. The lantern was still there, flickering with that strange, cold light, but the figure, the woman, was gone. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Something was very wrong, more than she could understand. The cold, the figure, the whispers. They all pointed to something deeper, something more sinister that was just beginning to unfold. She glanced around, her pulse racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare she was in. Then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet cracked, a deep rumble vibrating through the air. Emma stumbled back, her eyes wide in panic as the street began to warp, the very earth beneath her splitting apart. The mist thickened, swirling like a violent storm. Shapes, shadowy figures, began to emerge from the ground, rising up like phantoms, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light that had consumed the woman. They moved slowly, deliberately, toward her. Emma's breath hitched. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. They were like lead, trapped in the quicksand of this nightmare. The shadows closed in around her, their eyes fixed on hers, and a sense of recognition surged through her. They were not strangers. She had seen them before. In dreams, in fleeting memories, in places she couldn't quite remember. The figures weren't just figures. They were connected to her. They were part of the story she'd never wanted to face. Part of the reason why she had been running all this time. Suddenly, the woman's voice pierced the air, low and chilling, a whisper that seemed to echo from every direction. "You can't escape what you are, Emma. It was always going to find you." The words shattered the fragile illusion of safety Emma had been clinging to. The dread twisted into something much darker. She wasn't just lost in some unknown place. She wasn't just a victim of this foggy, haunted town. She was a part of it. And someone was waiting for her to return. As she opened her mouth to speak, to demand answers, the ground split wide open, and the figures surged forward, their movements quick and jerky, closing in on her with terrifying speed. Emma could feel her breath growing shallow, her pulse racing. She had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. But then, something unexpected happened. The light, the cold, distant light, flared brightly, blinding her for a moment. And when it faded, the figures were gone. The fog had cleared, and she was standing alone on the street. The air was still, but the unease remained, crawling under her skin like a slow-burning fire. Emma's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The figures, the woman's cryptic words, the light, none of it made sense. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had felt, had been turned upside down. There was more to this place, more to her than she could comprehend. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the real danger was waiting for her. The stillness of the street was deafening. Emma stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest, unsure if she was awake or still trapped in the nightmare. She looked around, but the fog was gone, and the shadowy figures had vanished without a trace. The eerie light that had flickered at the edge of her vision was now completely gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to press in on her from all sides. She took a tentative step forward, her legs shaky beneath her, and glanced around once more. The buildings were now clear, but something about them seemed off, like a memory that she could almost touch but not quite recall. It was as if she had always known this place, like it had been waiting for her. But waiting for what? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, a rustle behind her. Emma whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The figure, the woman, stood there once more, not in the distance, but right in front of her. Her pale face was as still as stone, her eyes glowing faintly, and her lips were curled into a faint, almost sad smile. "You thought you could escape," the woman said, her voice a haunting whisper, "but you can never outrun your past." Emma's stomach twisted. "What do you want from me? What is this place? Why are you here?" The woman's gaze softened, but there was something ancient and sorrowful in her eyes. "I am the keeper of memories," she replied, her voice trembling as if weighted with the burden of years. "I hold the stories of those who linger here, lost between worlds, unable to move on. And you, Emma, you are one of them." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" "I'm not like you, I'm alive. I don't belong here." The woman's eyes darkened, and she took a slow step closer, her voice growing colder. "You do, Emma. You always have. This place, It calls to you because it is part of you. You're not the first to come here, and you won't be the last. But you're the one who has been chosen to remember, to face the truth. Emma's mind reeled. Her chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name, a mix of fear, confusion, and something else, something darker. She reached out instinctively, but her fingers passed through the woman's figure like smoke, the coldness of her touch sending a shock through her body. "Why am I here?" Emma whispered, her voice breaking. The woman's expression softened, and for the first time, Emma saw a flicker of something like sympathy in her eyes. "Because you were never meant to forget, Emma. The memories, the pain. They're a part of you, and only by facing them can you break free. But be warned, the truth is not easy to accept. It will change everything." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The woman was fading again, her form shimmering like a fading dream. "You have to choose," she said, her voice barely audible now. "Stay in the shadows of this place, or wake up and confront who you truly are." The woman's figure dissolved completely, leaving Emma alone once more, standing in the middle of the street. The fog had returned, swirling in thick tendrils around her, and the eerie quiet had settled back into place. For a moment, Emma thought she might just turn and walk away. That she could leave this place, forget the woman, forget the cryptic words, and go back to her life. But something inside her, a cold, insistent feeling, stopped her. She had to know. She had to understand. What had been hidden from her? What had she forgotten? The fog thickened, and just as Emma took another step, something cold brushed against her cheek. She froze. It was the same chill she had felt before, the one that had paralyzed her, made her feel like she was being watched. But this time it was different. This time the chill wasn't just surrounding her. It was inside her, seeping deep into her bones. She closed her eyes, her breath shaky, and suddenly the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The buildings around her flickered, like they were slowly coming apart at the seams. And then she saw it, a figure emerging from the fog. A tall, shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with the same unnatural light. It wasn't the woman. It was something far worse. The figure took a step forward, and Emma could feel the pull, like gravity itself was shifting, pulling her closer to it. Her heart raced as it drew nearer, and with every step, the chill inside her deepened until she couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. And just as the figure reached out to touch her, everything went dark. Emma's world was engulfed in darkness, the weight of it pressing down on her chest like 1,000 invisible hands. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, everything felt numb. The cold, the chilling sensation she had felt moments before, was gone. It wasn't until she opened her eyes that she realized she wasn't in the street anymore. She was lying on the floor of a room. Familiar yet unsettling. It took a few moments for her to fully regain her bearings. The room was dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves filled with books, old photographs, and strange, forgotten trinkets. She recognized it. It was the attic of the house she had grown up in. But the air felt heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. She pushed herself up, her hands trembling as they brushed against the dust-covered floor. Her mind was foggy, but the memories were beginning to flood back. Fragments of her past, faces she had long since tried to forget. The attic, her parents' voices, the laughter of a childhood friend who had disappeared one summer. But there was something else now, something darker. The figure, the woman. A flash of pale eyes and a sorrowful smile. Emma felt a shiver crawl up her spine, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She understood now. Everything, the fog, the strange sensations, the woman's cryptic words. It was all connected. She had been running from her past for so long, trying to bury the things she didn't want to remember. But the truth always found its way out, didn't it? As Emma stood, she noticed a small wooden box on the table in front of her. It wasn't there before. Hesitantly, she opened it, revealing a faded photograph and a letter, written in her own hand. The photograph was of her as a young girl, standing in the garden with someone she barely recognized. Her brother, Thomas. The letter, though, was the most disturbing part. It read, "I know what you did. Come find me. The words hit her like a jolt of electricity. Thomas, her brother. The one she had tried so hard to forget. The one who had vanished all those years ago, leaving only unanswered questions in his wake. She hadn't thought about him in years, had convinced herself that his disappearance was a tragedy she would never have to face again. But here it was, staring her in the face. The past she had locked away had come back to claim her. A sound broke the silence. The door to the attic creaked open, and Emma turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway was the woman, the pale glowing figure. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, standing in the shadows, was Thomas. Older, yes, but unmistakably him. The same eyes, the same smile. He was there, standing in the room with her, and Emma could feel the weight of all the years she had spent trying to forget him. "You found me," Thomas said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I knew you would." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she stared at him, at the one person she had lost and tried to bury. But it wasn't just him, there was something else. Something she had never expected. The woman beside him smiled gently. "Sometimes," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries, "the past cannot be outrun. Must be faced. Only then can you move forward." Emma took a shaky step toward them, her heart heavy with guilt, with love, and with a deep, aching sense of relief. She had finally found the one thing she had been missing all these years, the truth. And in that moment the fog lifted. The room brightened. The cold was gone. As Emma embraced Thomas, she understood. She understood that the journey wasn't just about finding what was lost. It was about accepting it. The pain, the guilt, the sorrow. They were all parts of her, parts of who she was. And only by facing them could she finally be free. The woman stepped back, her eyes softening. "You're ready now," she said. "You can go home." And just like that, the fog disappeared, the shadows receded, and the attic felt like a room from her past, not something haunting her. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off her shoulders, and smiled. It wasn't over, but for the first time in years she felt at peace.